Hello, I am Sahar Wertheimer. I'm an REI fellow in my last year of fellowship at Cedars-Sinai, and I'm excited to be moderating with a panel on third-party reproduction with Rev. Gidon Weitzman and Yardena Bodenheimer. All our bios are below the screen, but I was going to ask, starting with Rev. Weitzman, if you could give us a little introduction into your day-to-day.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Nishmat and to both of my fellow panelists here for the opportunity to address you and to address the audience from literally all over the world. It's a big pleasure to be here. I work at PUA. I'm one of the senior rabbis here. I work in PUA in Israel, but also involved in what we do in America and throughout the world. On a daily basis, what I do is I counsel couples who have questions related to fertility, genetics, intimacy, developing adolescence, menopause, etc., etc. Really a whole gamut of questions related to female and reproductive health. I counsel them regarding the halachic aspects, medical aspects. I'm not a doctor, but to be able to guide them through the medicine and the medical aspects, their medical options. And most important, to give them a shoulder to cry on, or to feel of support, someone who's with them, who understands them, who doesn't judge them, and to be able to guide them through the process and also celebrate with them when they hopefully are successful, but also to commiserate with them when they're not yet successful, and also to enable them to have supervision, halakhic supervision in the lab, and also to educate. I spend a lot of time teaching and educating worldwide. Now it's very easy. Worldwide, you have to get on a plane and go somewhere. Sarah and I met last time, I think, in New York or in LA. But now we can meet here. I can sit in my office here or at home, even better. And we can teach all over the world regarding the aspects of fertility and halakha and the interaction between them.
Yes, and so many friends and patients have been touched by Machon PUA. Thank you so much for all your work. Yardena, if you could also give us some insight. I know you have quite the complex day-to-day.
Well, I work for the Israeli Ministry of Justice in the Jewish Law Department. That's my main line of work. And we are the Jewish law advisors for the legal advisor to the government. So that means that our word is the word in terms of legislation, proposed Israeli legislation, and also lawsuits that are brought against the state of Israel. We advise on significant cases, especially in the High Court and the High Court of Justice. And I am able to bring my skills there as a Nishmat trained Yoetzet Halacha, who specializes in reproductive questions. We went through a special training session, the Yoetzot Halacha, that were trained and answered general questions. I always dreamed of doing this, of answering fertility questions. And in fact, I accompany couples through the reproductive process, the trials and tribulations. I advise couples. I've been lecturing in this field basically since 1999, 2000 around the world. I traveled to the States and in England, and mostly in Israel though. And as I said, I bring together my legal and halachic knowledge. So that's basically what I do.
Amazing. So interesting. I think part of the reason I went into this field is how amazing the halachic aspect behind it really is. And I think this really highlights our, as Jews, what we can do to help somebody with reproduction and going to the depths of halacha really to figure it out. You're both probably too bright to concern yourself with television, but as you know, gestational carriers has been a hot topic because of shtisel. So I'm very excited to get into this today. And I'm going to start off just by generally asking, is one allowed to use a gestational carrier? And we will go through, I'll go through gestational carrier and then egg donors and sperm donors. I do want to touch on all of it. But I guess, Yardena, I'll start with you, and then if Rav Weitzman has anything to add.
I'm happy to begin. Actually, the first posek who allowed surrogacy and gestational carriers was Rav Zalman Chemya Goldberg, who allowed it publicly. And he was asked by the board that was allowed, in Israel, the way that the law works is that there's a board that reviews agreements that are brought to the board, and they have to say yes or no if they're going to allow a specific surrogacy agreement to go ahead. And they had a question and answer session with Razalman Nehemiah Goldberg, and he was basically to publicly state, I will allow, halachically, I will allow surrogacy, especially for a couple that doesn't have children. And since then, other rabbis have joined, but there are many who still disallow it. It's not something that's simple. And we have to realize that, we talk about using IVF and fertility technology, but when we do discuss surrogacy, we're not just talking about technology, but using someone else's body. And, it's a different question. We have a whole different psychological set of concerns. And I think that we have to be very sensitive as to when we are allowing and not allowing surrogacy. So I think that would be my basic answer. Rabbi Weitzman, I'd be happy if you would like to.
As you said correctly, we have to remember, go back a little bit, where IVF has been around for just over 40 years. The oldest IVF baby, Louise Brown, is just over 40. She was born in 1978. When IVF first started, all the rabbis were against it. Basically, across the board, everybody came out against IVF for a variety of reasons, mostly because of concern that they didn't know what was going on in the lab, and there was a concern there would be mistakes. And I think very much due to PUA's supervision and other such efforts to ensure that there was no mistake in the lab, there has been almost a turnaround in halachic opinion, and almost 100% agreement among the rabbis that this is permitted. Among certain cases, not every case will be permitted. I'll share with you a case that I think is problematic, and I think that it highlights. Just as we were planning this session a few minutes ago, I got a call from a couple who have already children, and they're doing IVF in order to choose the gender of their next child, which is a halachic question of itself. It happens to be that the woman is of such an age that I think that the chance of success will be very small. And I said to the man, that the doctor probably told you the chance of success is very small. And he was shocked. He said no one had ever told him that. I think it's very important to put that in, is that we have to realize that each case is individual and needs to be counseled individually. Because what is the chance of success? What are the ramifications? What are your other options? And so when we say things like gestational carrier, what are the other options? What are we talking about? Is it a woman who's born Rokitansky, has no uterus? Is it a woman who removed the uterus? Is the couple already have children? For some reason, she has Asherman? Or there's no medical reason. There's just a psychological reason. And those are all legitimate questions that need to be answered in their specific individual case. And I think that, as Yardena said, the most public discussion was the article in Aswan, in which it was the presentation of Zalman Nehemiah's comments of a permission, but that permission didn't mean every case is permitted. But he gave permission on a general sense that in certain cases when it would be necessary, when it would be qualified, then he would permit it. And of course the question is, who can be a gestational carrier? What are the circumstances? I think there's another aspect which is very important. It was touched on, Yardena touched on it, but I wanted to spend a moment thinking about it. Something that Rav Amar said. Rav Amar Shlita said that if we have a case of gestational carrier, there should be very minimal relationship and minimal interaction between the husband and the gestational carrier, the surrogate. And the reason for that is because the surrogate, the gestational carrier, is enabling this man to fulfill his mitzvah or his need or his desire to have a child. And in some cases, she's more successful in that than in fact his wife is. And it's very possible she may be younger, she may be have certain qualities that his wife doesn't have, and she's part of their life. And that's something we need to be taken into account, that there's not just a halakhic situation. There's also a social situation. There's also a reality of people with Yetzer and with their own desires and their own questions and their own situation. And that needs to be taken into account. And therefore, when we speak about the halakhic answer, it must be also taken into account the relationships that we're creating, the complexity of relationship. And that's true for all IVF. So if a couple would say, let's imagine that the husband doesn't come to give a sperm sample to the lab, and the woman's bringing it in and she's making a baby with the doctor. And I've heard that, even that expression used. I went to the doctor and made a baby. That's a very problematic statement. And when I don't have the husband as part of it, or when I don't have the wife as part of it, it's something that I need to stop the process and start counseling. Not only the halachic mutar asur aspect, permitted, forbidden. Also, what is the conception of conception that we're presenting that I think is equally important, that we need to think about that. Not only what we can do, but what we should be doing, what is appropriate to be done, when can it be done, how can it be done, why did the Kodesh Baruch Hu give us this gift of reproductive technology? What was the circumstances that it should be used for? And that, again, I think needs to be a very individual answer, not answerable in this forum. But to everybody listening should understand that there are specific details and specific complications that need to be considered before we can move forward with something like a gestational carrier.
Sahar, I just wanted to add one thing, that what Rabbi Weitzman referred to originally, that the Tzitz Eliezer originally forbade even doing IVF, and other poskim such as Rav Ovadia Yosef allowed it. And then really the religious community voted with its feet, if so to speak. But the basic concerns underlying the positions, Rav Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, was concerned about where technology would lead us and how far it would build or decompose the family, so to speak. And at the time, Rav Nevinsal wrote him a beautiful response. And his response, I think, gives us food for thought in all of the technologies that we think about. He said, is this going to be a technological advance that will help save a couple and bring a family together, right? That's the way we need to look at it. And then it's super important to do it. And I just want to say that, when I'm going to answer in the future the next questions, I'm going to give a basic halachic approach and then talk about the broad in the United States or in England or anywhere abroad. And then lastly, address Israel specifically. I think people are interested. A lot of people call and say, can I do what I want to do in Israel? So we'll get to that. But I think that the basic thing is really, if we're saving a family, bringing them together and allowing them to have children, and Israeli legislation reflects that. In surrogacy, if you have more than 2 children, you're not allowed to do a surrogacy in Israel if you're an Israeli citizen. It's actually part of legislation.
Wow. So in that case, maybe we can just talk a little bit more briefly about if, and Rav Weitzman, you did address, that it could be nuanced each case individually, but if it were to be allowed, if somebody did get a heter to use a gestational carrier, their situation, what would be ideal? Should she be Jewish? Should she be not Jewish? Should she be married? Should she be single? Should she be paid? Should it be a chesed?
That's an excellent question. Gestational carriers, I just heard, is a complex issue. One of the major issues that there is a sort of amount of contention and disagreement about is how do we define motherhood? And as I said before, we have to change the whole conception of conception, because in the classic view of motherhood, the mother gives both the genetic material and she delivers the baby, or she carries gestation to the baby and carries the baby and delivers the baby, and that's how you become a mother. In reproductive technology, and pretty quickly after Louise Brown was born, this technology caught up to the fact that we don't need to have the same mother giving the genetics and the same mother gestating and delivering. We could change that because we can create life in the petri dish or in the test tube. So pretty quickly we got up to the point that we are making a distinction between them. And there's been a very, very fierce, and many people listening and everybody on this panel knows that there's been a fierce and ongoing debate about which of those is more formative, genetics or pregnancy and birth. Which of those is the most formative? And there's been very significant voices on both sides without going into the details. And there's been a question whether some people changed their mind and thought one thing at one point and then changed their mind, and maybe has become more aware of the technology or more aware of genetics. And I think it's an ongoing debate. Since that is the case, so we'll pretty much not go into history. I think that I said many times to my students, I think it'll be a fascinating PhD thesis to look at the change and the laws of fertility and halakha of fertility, how they changed and how we've come to where we are today. But let's look where we are today. Today, pretty much most poskim will say that the best, when we talk about a gestation carrier, is probably to get a Jewish single gestation carrier. And then the question, if we do not have that, do we need to convert the child, really convert the child, what we call medina, we'd actually need to convert the child, or convert the child out of a stringency, out of a possible doubt that maybe the child is or is not Jewish. And there are many different voices upon that. So that would, we in Tuan, I think the generally, as I say, follow the majority opinion. That's what Razama Nechemia was quoted before, follows, although there are other voices, as Yardena said correctly, there have been very many other voices subsequent with different opinions. But pretty much the bulk of opinion is that a single Jewish woman solves most of the problems. And that's pretty much what we promote. I think that there's another aspect that it was a little bit alluded to before, is that when we talk about a non-Jewish donor, especially when we talk about in Israel and in other places in Europe, where that's not so always available, people often will look overseas. And there have been very major cases in places like India and other countries in which there have been women who are willing, we don't know exactly how willing they are, but they are available for the uterus to be sold. And often there is a very big question about the conditions that they're held in and their willingness and how ethical that is. And that's also a halachic question. Not only should we be thinking about the Mutar and Asur, the Shulchan Aruch, but we should think about how to be human beings, how to promote good in the world. And if we're causing somebody stress and distress and discomfort in order to have a baby, that's something we need to think about. And so we often speak about it to couples, to speak about that we cannot condone any use of somebody against their will. And I think it goes back to the part of the question you asked, is how much people get paid. Obviously, it would be wonderful if it would be all altruistic. That would be, amazing. But the reality is people have to spend almost a year of testing and treatment and being pregnant, which is not so easy for a lot of people, obviously. I'm the only person here that maybe will never experience that. Who knows, maybe in the technology will change. I'll also one day be able to experience a pregnancy, but you will be able to. And you know that it's not so easy. And therefore there should be some remuneration that is around, and I don't speak about it on the legal spec, but I think halachically as well, a person shouldn't be paid to sell their body parts. In fact, there's a very nice article by Rav Yisrael Meir Lau, that he says, think about a society we create where people will sell their body parts. He doesn't think about just carrier. He speaks about organ donor. That would be a terrible society. However, can we say people can't pay for that? That's a good question. If the money becomes an ability to somebody who wants to be able to do it because they now will have the ability to do those tests and to be pregnant, fine. But if the money becomes really the incentive, people are only doing it for the money, that's something that we halachically would have a big problem with. Someone using money as an incentive to encourage somebody to do something they don't want to do is always going to be halachically problematic, and also I think ethically problematic, or maybe the opposite, maybe ethically problematic, and therefore will also be halachically problematic.
There is a little bit of noise carrying through. If everybody can mute when somebody else is speaking, I think that will help the person speaking. But I did want to, okay, so kind of on the tails of that question, and maybe, Ardina, maybe you can answer this. Is there an amount or a price that is then too much? Because maybe effectively we're taking away somebody's free will by offering a certain amount. Because we know pregnancy can be incredibly high risk. And although, in the 21st century, very few women lose their lives in pregnancy and childbirth, it is absolutely still a risk. And so, I kind of struggle with, sometimes I think we're giving too little. But, is there a ballpark range where it's kind of better?
Well, I took part in the committee discussions in the Knesset on whether we should legislate like a specific cap on how much a person can take to do surrogacy. And it was debated because there are certain extenuating circumstances and not everybody could, deal with a certain amount. But it's not, I don't think it's unheard of that there's going to be a cap in Israel on how much one is going to take. On the other hand, I think that what is really important in addition to the amount is that whoever's handling the agreement puts certain other safety features in the agreement and ensures free will. Because as much as the money is a factor, what the studies have discovered vis-a-vis surrogates is that they don't just do it for the money. I mean, like 80% or something like that report, they do it also for the satisfaction of really giving to the other person. And I want to say that one of the things that Rabbi Weitzman started to say about the conditions that the surrogate is in whatever country, and it's also the treatment and the attitude of the couple. As much as we want to ensure that there is not that close connection in any way between the future father and the surrogate, on the other hand, I believe that there has to be an attitude of respect and of thankfulness toward the surrogate that even carries on afterward. If it's just sending a card and saying, you know, this child is still doing well, and the person who is the gestational carrier mother has a feeling that the couple is grateful and acknowledges her part in that, I think in many ways is reported in studies to be extremely significant to the surrogates. So I think that the question of the morality of how much has to be linked to the other safeguards on her health and on her consent and on the conditions and on the attitude of the couple. I have heard couples relate to the surrogate in a very, what would be the word, ownership almost way, and I've gently tried to talk to them about the fact that we're entering into a human relationship here, and it's very important to be very exact about what type of relationship, including the money. By the way, Sahar, in the United States and in Canada, there are the highest rates. You were worried that we don't pay enough, but the highest rates around the world are in the United States and in Canada right now. And so many Israelis.
In Israel, I meant the world at large.
Well, no, in the world at large. And the lower rates are in Eastern Europe and in India and places like that, although India has now legislated that foreigners can't do surrogacy there, so that's been cut off. But we do have to be aware of paying too little or too much. I do think that we, as people who advise couples, I do think we need to help, even if there's not a specific legal constraint in place.
So to me, the preference for a single Jewish woman is interesting, and I think it's probably very much limits who we can use, or if somebody is looking for a gestational carrier, where to find one. How does Judaism and Orthodox Judaism, where I can imagine that a single Jewish woman, you know, outside of the context of a relationship, you know, being pregnant can be a little sticky, maybe both for her own prospects or how do we deal with that? How do we help women find the right gestational carrier? Are we aware that we're limiting it and we're okay with it? What is the kind of take on that?
I make it even more difficult because at least in Israel, and I would advise all over the world, is that the gestational carrier should have already given birth, because we don't want her first birth to be a gestational carrier birth. It's a very.
Are you saying medically or halachically?
Halachically, and also legally in Israel that is the case. I think it's the case pretty much encouraged in other countries, that Yardena will know much better. She's an expert in law, much more than I am. But that's generally what I would encourage. So that very, very much limits who we're able to have as a gestational carrier. And there are couples that have used other gestational carriers, be they married or be they Jewish, be they non-Jewish, with the caveats that we said before. The question about sharing that information, which you a little bit touched on, is she'll come. Let us take it tachlis. She'll come to shul in Los Angeles or in New York or anywhere else in the world, and we know she's a single woman. She's in her 30s and was married because she already has a baby. She was married, but now she's divorced, or in other less difficult circumstances. She's now single, and she suddenly comes and she's pregnant, and of course. There are a lot of questions, and I probably Yardena said before, there's a lot of rabbis who are against gestational carriers, and that's one of the questions that they had. There will be a chashad, there will be a concern, there will be a serious eyebrows raised that this has been conceived in an inappropriate relationship, in a sexual relationship which would be forbidden for her. And the answer to get around that is to share that information, and that's the responsibility of that person, but also of the community, the rabbi of the community, to know that this person is doing a chesed, doing incredible kindness to another person. The other way would also be for the recipient, for the intended parents, or the genetic parents who will receive the baby at birth. And I agree 100% in the relationship has to be extremely gracious and particular. But again, it could become more than that. And I think that's what Rav Amma was concerned about. It should be appropriate. And of course, treating someone with derogatory is not appropriate in any way, in any relationship, and definitely not in this. And I 100% agree with that, and that's very, very important. I just on that, there's one note because you mentioned it. They asked Rav Yaakov Edelstein Zatzal. A couple had a baby who was sick, and the kid got better, and they said, "What gift should we bring to the doctor?" He said, "Don't give them a gift, but every single year on the child's birthday, come to the hospital with the child and say, this child is now 5, 6, 7 because of your efforts." Because everybody is very nice to the doctor, but then they give him a bowl, a box of chocolates, flowers, a bottle of wine, and that's it. And the idea that it is ongoing, my child is now 15, 16, 17, married, their own children because of you, that's an incredible gift. So that's a beautiful thing to think about in all medicine, including in here, in any relationship. Yeah. So to go back to the recipient, the woman who's going to raise the child, is also not going to be pregnant, and suddenly she's going to turn up with a baby. And so I had a student who's daughter of a reproductive endocrinologist, quite a well-known one. I'm sure we all know who it is. And he had a patient who came, and she would put every month she went to a special theatrical I guess with the costume, and they would build a pregnancy that would now appropriate for the month, and that was how she covered it up. Is that something we would promote? I think the answer is no. I think that there are much more appropriate ways of dealing with that question, of understanding that in our community, this is the relationship that's happening, and that's also, I think, a learning opportunity for the community to understand the complexity, to have empathy for that person and what they're going through, both the gestational carrier and the parents, and to understand with all the complexities, this is how they'll have their child, and that'll be kasher 100%. And I think it's the onus often on the rabbi to give the hechsher, to say, I am involved in this case, and this is appropriate. And when it is appropriate, when it's done that way, I think that overcomes a lot of that guilt or shame or embarrassment that theoretically would happen. There's no embarrassment or shame that I was born with a particular condition, that I developed a condition. That's not embarrassment or shame. That's Baruch Hashem. That's HaKadosh Baruch Hu made you born in the 20th century, 21st century, where we have the ability to deal with that. And Absolutely. So I think it needs to be handled properly, but I think it can be handled properly.
Absolutely. So interesting. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm sure there's much more we can speak about on this, but I want to move on to kind of the same questions with an egg donor. Are we allowed to use egg donors? Is it better if they're Jewish or not Jewish, single or married, etc.? Yardena, do you want to start?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I'll also make one comment that will relate to the surrogacy, but from the point of view of using an egg donor. Basically, the same consideration would apply, because as Rav Weitzman correctly said, the opinions are split pretty much down the middle in halacha, whether the gestational carrier, whether the person who is carrying the pregnancy, if she's the mother getting an egg donation, if it's a different question, or whether the person donating the egg or the person giving her own gametes to have her own children and using a surrogate, which one is the mother? I just for one second want to do a certain slight promo that might help people around the world, at least if they want to turn to their rabbis, because it's right now in Hebrew, but in Asia, in this, there's an article that I helped co-author that has in it an actual list that summarizes all of the halachic positions. I'm just going to raise it for 1 second. It's like a large chart. Mm-hmm. And so it's in the volume that is, 1 second, Kuftet 115, 116 in Asia. So if there's somebody that really wants to like a reference chart for themselves so as to feel comfortable with what other opinion they're using, feel free to.
That's excellent. Yeah, and can I know I said we're going to move on, but is there a difference, and you can give me a really short answer, we don't have to go in depth, is there a difference between Sephardic and Ashkenaz halacha?
No, not across the board.
Okay.
That's a simple answer. It's Africa, there isn't.
Okay.
It's a
Okay.
two of the most prominent, Sephardic poskim of the last generation, Rav Ovadia Yosef and Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, had different opinions on this.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
one example.
I can guess who said what, but okay.
The preference would be for a Jewish single egg donor, the same
Across
way.
Okay.
Well, hold on one second. I'll tell you in a minute. It is linked to the question of what you spoke about. Can a child inadvertently, who is born of egg donation, would they ever be inadvertently marrying a sibling? In general through gamete donation, and some poskim for that reason, in terms of egg donation, would actually prefer a non-Jewish egg donor who halachically the child would not be related, at least according to those poskim who hold that the child is related through the gametes. And then they would prefer that the child be converted so as to prevent that inadvertent genetic problem. However, that having been said, so I would say that the preference would be a single Jewish egg donation, secondly, a non-Jewish egg donation, and thirdly, a married Jewish egg donation. There is a minority of poskim that hold that if you are holding that the mother is the genetic mother, then just the very fact that the husband's sperm met with a married egg, so to speak, an egg from a married Jewish donor would have a slight possibility of one opinion of being considered a mamzer or not able to marry Jewishly. And for that reason, both in surrogacy and in egg donation, we see that as the least preferable option. However, I do want to.
Can you just repeat those three things again? So the first was?
The first one would be a Jewish single egg donor. Okay. The second would be a non-Jewish egg donor, and the third would be a married Jewish egg donor who many poskim would not allow, just as they would not allow a married gestational carrier who's Jewish. Okay.
But that's still, so even if we have a Jewish single egg donor, we still have that question of siblings.
So for 1 second, I wanted to talk about the difference between the world and Israel. As I said, the general halacha and then the world in Israel.
Yes.
In order to make sure that siblings do not marry, I am of the firm belief, and those who hold these halachic opinions, that at a certain age, it is incumbent upon the parents to tell their child that they are born of an egg donation or of a surrogate, in order for them to have the information that will allow them to prevent it themselves. There is no 100% guarantee unless the person themselves can guarantee it. In Israel, there is a registry. There is a surrogacy registry of the children born of surrogacy, and there is an egg donation registry of the children born of egg donations. And the registrar of marriage, when a child born comes to marry, the registrar has the authority to access that registry and ensure that those children do not marry if they're forbidden to each other, right? So we can make sure, that's theoretically. But does the registrar of marriage even know to look up that information? Not unless he's tipped off by the person themselves. So we see that I believe that as much as it is a very sensitive situation, at some point in time, I believe that if we do allow it, the child themselves needs to know. Now, the one thing I want to say is that if you do use a non-Jewish egg donation, or if you do use a non-Jewish gestational carrier, one must know that across the board, I believe it's the moral thing to do, not just to say, I hold by a certain posek who allows this, and therefore my child is definitely Jewish. I think there is there's a case to be made for what Rav Zalman Nechemia also said, for covering one's bases and at least approaching a rabbinic court and saying what the situation is, and doing at the very least a giyur l'chumra. And as Rabbi Weitzman said again and again, one needs specific advice for a couple, and especially a couple, let's say, around the world, who on the one hand is not necessarily mitzvah observant, but on the other hand, definitely wants to ensure they have a Jewish child. It's so important to people. I've met people from the most secular kibbutzim who they say, but I want a Jewish child. Yeah. And so that step of ensuring that the child needs a giur, a conversion, or at least a giur l'chumra is a very important step, I think, to at least consider and consult with a rabbi about. And I would hope that the batei din that do the conversion of children would utilize more, I don't know, lenient tests of conversion in these kind of cases, especially when it's a safek. And I want to add one more thing, because I don't know if I'm going to have the chance to put this in, and I want to remember to say it. Right now, we're addressing an audience, I think you're an incredible audience out there, who's trying to follow so much information. And it could be that you're a person who's already had a child by way of surrogacy or egg donation. And you might hear something on this or on another program that causes you to panic. Wait, does that mean my child has a blemish? Or does that mean my child will never be Jewish? And I want to reassure you, please talk to somebody who's really in the know. Talk to Rabbi Weitzman at Pua, talk to somebody at Nishmat, because I would say that 99.9% of the cases, you haven't done anything wrong with your child. Your child will be fine. And it's very, very important. I've had women run to me after hearing such a program and say, wait a second, does that mean my child is, and it's not. So even though we're giving you advice what to do, if you want to preemptively know what to do, ex post facto, there's different answers and different solutions, and please do not panic. Know that you've done the right thing and you can solve it.
Okay.
I would say on that subject, it's very important that when I counsel a couple who are about to embark on any third party treatment, is to tell them there's a difference of opinion. And I tell them, even though we're going to go with one opinion, or we're going to follow, we're going to cover a basis, you should know that there are different opinions. Why? And exactly what you just said. You'll sit in a shiur one day, and you'll hear the rabbi say, these children are not Jewish. Or, we Sephardim hold like this, which is, we just heard is not true. But that you'll hear that because people have different opinions, people understand halakha differently, and you will be panicked. Know that there is a difference of opinion. And I think that in fertility, we have to realize that, I'll tell you a story that will make us realize. A couple came to me and they needed to use third party, a very, very, what we like to say in the press, ultra-Orthodox couple. And they came and they needed to use third party, and we were discussing, and it's not such a simple question as you've heard even from our very brief discussion here. And I said to the husband, maybe we should ask your rabbi. And he said, Rabbi Weitzman, I have no other choice. I understand my options. This is what I have to do. And therefore, we have to move on with it. We have to realize that even though they're halachic minefields, and these are halachic minefields, their fathers, my grandfather's atzal, if he would hear of this question, he wouldn't even begin to fathom how his grandson could actually deal with these on a daily basis, how the batei din can deal with it on a daily basis. And yet we have to realize that behind all these questions are real life people with real life pain. And our obligation as Rabbanim, as reproductive endocrinologists, as Yoatzot, is to alleviate that pain, is to try to find a way to navigate the system. And I think that Yarden is correct. There is a way to navigate the system. My suggestion would be do it de jure, not de facto. Try to get, before you start, the best possible solution, because even though Yarden said, I always say that not everybody eats kosher, but they want to have kosher children. You don't know where your child's going to end up. We don't know that one day he'll be in a community that'll be very different than the community that he grew up in. I don't know where we all grew up in, but the community I grew up is not the community I live in now. I grew up in England, I live in Israel. That's not the different set of understanding of the
right.
halakha.
Right.
You don't know where your children are going to end up. Make sure, if you can, de jure, ask a halachic authority who knows what they're talking about. Baruch Hashem, there are poskim throughout the world, and there's Pua, which is available out the world, and others who know what they're talking about, who are able to guide you. Make sure you get that guidance before you embark. If you're listening and you already have a child, then exactly as Yardena said, we have to find a solution. And sometimes the solution can be simple, and sometimes a little bit more complex. But you will, a lot of times, a couple will save themselves a lot of heartache, or a single person will save themselves a lot of heartache if they first consult with an authority and only then embark on it, for their own well-being and for the well-being of their child.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. Okay, so just I do want to kind of get back to that question of disclosure to the children and marrying potential siblings. But first, I just wanted to, for the sake of being complete, discuss a sperm donor. And should that sperm donor be Jewish or non-Jewish? Should they be known or anonymous? I know this can be one of the most complex areas. Rabbi Weitzman, if you want to start this one.
Neither of the speakers was willing to take that up, so you had to choose somebody. As you said,
I'll give you both a chance.
All third party is complex. It happens to be that sperm donor, while it's a very complex issue, is in fact the most written about because it's been done for the longest. While egg donation is relatively new, it's only really been done. We said the first successful IVF was in 1977, birth in 1978. And egg donations were only in the 80s, when we think that a lot of the poskim of the previous generation had already died. The sperm donor has been done for generations, and for decades we've been doing successfully sperm donor. And so we have actually a large amount of halachic material. Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rav Mashash. You wanted Ashkenazi and Sephardi, so we'll give you both. Rav Rosenthal, and many, many others have written this. Many have written about sperm donor. And while again, most poskim did not want to permit it, Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach both permitted in very specific circumstances, but they were adamant that to get around a lot of the halachic questions, which we don't have the forum today to discuss, but a lot of halachic questions, strongly to prefer a non-Jewish donor. And anybody who is thinking about embarking on a case of using a sperm donor, which itself is a question, we said, preempt the question. And it was said to many people that it's not always so simple to give a permission, but the least they should use non-Jewish sperm. And a lot of people think that's sort of counterintuitive, that intuitively I would want to have Jewish, but halachically, in fact, it's opposite for a question about the lineage and questions about the possibility of siblings marrying, which with the non-Jewish is very different. And so they did permit it. There's been discussions whether Rav Moshe Feinstein subsequently changed his mind. Rav Moshe Feinstein is adamant that he did not change his mind. But the reality is that most of the cases that Rav Moshe was speaking about in the 60s and 70s are irrelevant today, because our technology has developed to the point that we have testicular biopsies. We have the ability to remove sperm in in almost all cases. We have intracytoplasmic sperm injection. We have ICSI, which and so Sahar learned in the first year already of RE. You ought to learn how to do ICSI and understand what it was. And so we've developed to the point that in many cases we don't need to use it.
So I have a question there. Is one obligated, if they have male factor infertility, is he obligated to go to the extent of doing a TESI before using a sperm donor halachically?
So TESI is a very big question about, and again, we don't have necessarily the time and to discuss it, but just on one level, an article that I wrote some years ago was looking around the question of TESI can also cause someone to be halachically castrated, what we call daka, which is itself a complex issue. But most of the poskim, again, we have a lot of written about this because we've been doing biopsy since the 50s. So we have a lot written about that. So most of the poskim permitted it in certain circumstances for a difference of reasons why. And so I think that if a man would come to me, and we have that every day. I can think in the past week I've had 3 cases. It says no sperm count, azospermia, or low sperm count, or white deletions, or all of the other reasons why a man would have a very, very low sperm count. Definitely, we would encourage them strongly to pursue first some sort of operation to find sperm, testicular exploration. And if that failed, then the next discussion would be to have sperm donor. It should also be noted, and I have this discussion a lot, I have discussion with somebody today, that a lot of times people don't want to use sperm donor. And a lot of times it's the wife who says, sperm donor is off the table. That we're not going to discuss. We'll discuss that. And I said to a woman, you understand that the price may be you will not have children. She said, that's a price I'm willing to take. It's fine. We can adopt, we can have other things. That's fine. I'm not giving a judgment call. But I think that a lot of times, even though we suggest sperm donor, there are cases in which it is permitted. A lot of times the couple say, Adkan, we married each other to have his sperm, my eggs, and sperm donor, and maybe often much more than egg donor. because women are much more willing to undergo egg donor than they are to go sperm donor for the husband.
That's interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I think that's overall true, but one of the things I did hear recently from Rav Yaakov Ariel about generally about egg donation is that one of his qualifications of doing the entire process is that one absolutely makes sure that the other partner is 100% on board with, if it's the egg donation or with the sperm donation, and are not just giving lip service to the answer. It's a very, very, it's a basic, it's a halachic and ethical condition to doing the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very, very important. I just do want to mention a certain statistic in Israel, and this is not to say in any way that we are halachically advocating or condoning, but about 95% of the women receiving sperm donations are single in Israel. And several of them will also ask the same question: is there a preference for this or that type of a sperm donation? And in that case, a single woman is able to consider a Jewish donor if he's a known donor. And that is not available in Israel. A known Jewish sperm donor is not available in Israel. They are available in certain places abroad, and one should check it out. And also, when I say known, there's a difference. And this is something I think also I'd like to address very, very briefly: the question of a known donor versus an anonymous donor, and the question of secrecy. Right now, in the law in Israel, the default is taking an anonymous egg donor, okay? But the law does allow for one to bring a known egg donor, which then obviously would go around all of the problems of secrecy or of marrying the child, etc., because you know who the donor is. There is not such a comparable construct within Israeli law, because there is no Israeli law on sperm donors. There is legislation that is underway, and I think it's very important legislation because it's done so much and it's so prevalent, as Rabbi Weitzman said, that it is important to make sure that we have legislation in place that gives safeguards to all of the people that are involved.
Mm-hmm.
I personally do think that it's important in both areas to have both a known and an anonymous track. Many will not donate without having an anonymous track, but I think that if somebody would ask me, and if they were a single woman, which is a completely different case than a married woman, which 100% it has to be a non-Jewish donor, I think there is room to consider a known Jewish donor. Now, also, when I say that, when I say known—
Can you give a little background as to why? I know that's a very complex question. We are running out of time, but I would love to hear just maybe 30 seconds.
I'll give you a few reasons. A child wants to know their identity. This has come out recently. They do want to know their genetic identity at some point. And what's the safeguard, I think, that would be something that would strike a middle ground, would be something similar to the law of adoption in Israel, where the child would have the right at age 18 at least, or 16 or whatever, to know the genetic information, to know about who the parent is, also for medical reasons. It's not something that then it would remove the question of a contact or a tie between the parents and the genetic parent. But it would at least give that safeguard to the child and answer their questions about where they're from and their identity. And as I said, certainly prevent one from marrying another one. I think that's also right Jewishly. I think there's the concept in Judaism of the Shekhinah dwelling on those that know their lineage. And I think that there's something that in ancient Israel, adoptions were something more open. And it was considered a zchut to raise a child. And I think that, now we know the truth will out. There's internet, there's tests, there's all kinds of things. And for me, it would be awful if the child would find out inadvertently, oh, I was born from this guy that had 100 children or something like that. And the fact that it could be ordered and organized so the child at a certain point in time could know in a safe way what the identity was, I think would both be the correct thing to do and go around a lot of problems that could be caused inadvertently.
I'm just struggling, sorry to cut you off. I'm just struggling with how is it different if she's married or single?
So the one thing that's different married or single in terms of having a known Jewish donor versus a non-Jewish donor is because of the concern that there is an issue of mamzerut. If the woman is married because she's having a child with a Jewish man who's not her husband, if she is a married woman, we would strongly, strongly say that one should take a non-Jewish donor in order
so
to go.
It's really Jewish sperm, but if she's married, then non-Jewish to avoid mamzerut.
Right, and the reason I'm saying a known Jewish donor in terms as opposed to a non-known Jewish donor for a single woman is because there's an additional problem of a child being considered what's called a shtuki, which is a person born from an unknown Jewish father. It's a secondary consideration, and it's something that can also be circumvented. But if the person would want to know if they were single and wanted to know, then the non-Jewish sperm or a known Jewish sperm donor could both be on the table, but not for a married woman. Okay. That's what I do.
I'm just going to recap.
I wanted to say on both of those points, it's important to stress. First of all, that I think that it's important to recognize that there are many halachic questions and problems with a single woman having a child, and those need to be addressed. Again, preempted. A lot of times we get the question of, okay, I'm pregnant. What happened? What's the status of the child? I'm pregnant with Jewish sperm that I don't know who it is. And exactly as Yardena said, I now have a potential shtuki. There are a lot of questions. And I think it's to be important to stress that this is not, and we've discussed this prior to starting, that it's very important to stress that a lot of times single women ask, what's better, Jewish or non-Jewish? And I think it's important to stress that this is in itself a halachic problem, a single woman. That's the first thing. And I think the other thing with known donors, it depends how well you know that donor. So let's imagine that we have a woman who froze eggs. I have a case that we're dealing with now, a woman who froze eggs because she's going through cancer treatment. Bezrat Hashem, she'll get better, but let's say she doesn't. And that woman is now, let's say, not around, we have frozen eggs. It's different than using my neighbor or using my sister, who's also a known donor, who the interaction, as we said before, may be very, very complex. That when I go to a simcha and my child is going wild, and my donor says, how can you treat my son like that? Why don't you look after them? And whose son is it? The child now has questions. Is it my aunt is my mother, or my this woman's my mother? I think we need to think about it. Here we're saying it somewhat in a flippant way and in a somewhat humorous way, but we have to recognize these are complex issues. Before embarking on either of those, there should be definite input from a rabbi and from an expert rabbi to understand not only the ramifications for myself, but also the ramifications for my child. We just had a case. One second, there's one thing.
I just put that in. They could also consult with an expert. You said halacha in this case. Some of the or women might feel more comfortable to give the push to.
We had a case of a woman who, when at 18, suddenly discovered that she was born from a sperm donor, and she didn't know, but the mother knew. It was such a complex issue. A woman 18 years old, she never knew that. And it was just very, very complex. And I agree, it should be someone who's an expert, whoever that expert is, someone who knows what they're talking about, who can back up that with real halachic weight. That's an important issue before embarking on those questions. And there's something that we can segment at the end, but that de facto is always worse than de jure.
Yes.
And de jure we should know that these are questions that need to be thought about. Because again, not only they're not mutar v'asur questions, they're not permitted or asur. There's a whole issue that is involved. There's a whole social framework that needs to be taken into account. That's very, very important.
Yes. And I often say this, and maybe one day we'll do it. I don't know, HIPAA and stuff like that. But in a situation where we have women coming to us to try and get pregnant without a partner, and men coming to us to try and get pregnant without a partner, where is our matchmaking of these people who are interested in a family, right? We need to open up a department for that. But anyways, I digress. If they're interested in having a partner, but to just summarize, so ideally, and acknowledging that this is complex and every situation is individual, we're saying that a gestational carrier preferably is Jewish and single. A egg donor is preferably Jewish and single. And a sperm donor is preferably non-Jewish if we're talking about a married woman, and Jewish if we're talking about a single woman.
I want to add in one thing though. When we are talking about an egg donor, the reality is, at least in Israel, that it is very, very difficult to find a single Jewish egg donor. And so that if a person is having a really hard time with that, they should come to a halachic authority and consult if they can use a non-Jewish egg donor, because it might be the reality that that's all they can obtain, and it really depends on their age. And we don't want to push them maybe over the edge in terms of not being able to have a child at all. So please consult, because it can be a possibility on the table in terms of availability. It's a very important factor to take into consideration.
Okay.
I would
So
also
we
add
are
on your list, I would say that for everybody, non-Jewish sperm is much, much more preferable than using Jewish sperm for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're single, married, male.
okay.
That I would definitely suggest is if you very concisely put that list. I think sperm donor, all of the poskim spoke about non-Jewish, and that's the thing we should try to uphold that. And that's pretty easy. That's very available, so it's easy to have, unlike egg donors.
Okay. Right. So in the last 10 minutes, I just want to go back to that point that Yardena had started to mention about disclosing to the children if they were born of third-party reproduction, and also of inadvertently, whether it's because of an egg donor, like a shared mother or a shared father, of siblings inadvertently marrying each other. And I want to kind of, if you would address it, halachically, like is the surrogate, so, we have the question of with an egg donor and the same mother, by like the same carrier mother, and then also an egg donor with a gestational carrier, who's considered the mother, which one do we give the halachic status of siblings to, and then, kind of just to distinguish it from medically, the issue of, overlapping genetics or having very close genetic pool, which it's hopefully something that we can overcome, but I will say that with a lot of caution, because even if we were to do something like pre-implantation genetic diagnosis or testing, we know that when the genetics are so close together, perhaps there's things we're not picking up on genetic panels that could potentially still be a problem when there's so much sequence homology between the two. But on a halachic level, if you could, Yardena, maybe since you began to talk about it, and then Rabbi Weitzman, and then I think we'll be out of time.
Well, I think that I'll address it from the point of view, first of all, just of in this case of Israeli law that has thought very carefully about this, and therefore in the legislation created a registry so as to prevent siblings from inadvertently marrying. But as I said before, that will only work if the parent has told the child that they're born either from a surrogate or from an egg donor.
But that statement is kind of implying that we don't want these siblings to get married. Is that correct?
For sure.
And is that halachically or medically?
Both. And I'll mention even halachically, if those children marry and if they're siblings, their offspring will be a mamzer, so that will be not Jewishly unable to marry. So that's incredibly important, and it's brilliant, I think, that in the state of Israel, Israeli legislation takes halakha so seriously that they create a registry to prevent that. So that even if the medical community were to agree that it might be okay, they would say, no, we want to protect these children halachically. I think that's a beautiful statement of a Jewish state that wants to take these things into consideration. Now, I think there is a certain difference between surrogacy and egg donors, because surrogacy is much harder to keep a secret overall, and there will be talk in the community. And I think that a parent not telling a child that they're born of a surrogate would in a sense almost be foolish, because it's going to come out and probably in a way the parents wouldn't want it to. So I don't even think there's really even a question there. In terms of egg donation, I think in the past, parents have been consulted and told maybe not to say something about the egg donor because you don't want to bring another person into the relationship. But I do think that halachically at a certain age, it is the right thing to do, and to give the child the knowledge for many, many halachic reasons. And as I said, not least, that at a certain point when they do come to that registry, they're able to tell the registrar or themselves, check. They can even do a genetic test with somebody. And I think it is their right. Interestingly enough, there was a young man in his 20s who came to the Knesset and said, I found out late in life that I was born of a sperm donor. And honestly, I'm not a religious guy, but really, I don't want to meet somebody who's my sibling, my half sibling, and I'm worried about it. And I want that there to be a way that I would be able to, I'm not going to do a blood test with every girl I date, sorry. I don't think that's going to work. I want there to be a legal way that I would be able to approach a registry and just put in a question to make sure negatively that I'm not related to this person, because I do know that I'm born in this way. So I think that at a certain age, it is appropriate to tell the child in order to prevent chas v'shalom that situation.
So to clarify, both for an egg donor and a sperm donor, there's no difference. The genetic children are considered siblings, halachically.
By most opinions, yes. With regard to the sperm donor, there's a certain question about it, but I'm not going to get into it in depth. I would certainly advise people to consider them, at least l'chumra, to be siblings, because as Rav Asher Weiss said, he said, in these modern questions, I can't have 100% firm opinion one way or the other. The children are considered genetically related. These questions are new questions, and we don't have a 100% opinion. Therefore, I always have to act cautiously, halakhically, and I have to consider them related in order to cover my bases. And so then I would definitely advise that everybody cover their bases halakhically.
And so does a non-Jewish sperm donor obviate that question?
Halakhically, yes.
Okay. And then if you could, Rev Weitzman, also talk about gestational carriers, just to clarify again. So gestational carriers are their children, if it's from an egg donor, are their children from two different egg donors considered siblings?
So again, I think that the question, and it was raised here and covered, that there is a difference of opinion. And I agree, and Rav Asher Weiss said to me, you can imagine the question about Judaism, whether the child will be thinking they're Jewish their whole life and they get to Olam Haba and they're not, because in Olam Haba they hold by a different opinion. We have to be careful. I think we have to be, again, we have to be careful de jure, and we have to be careful de facto. There is a registry, although it's a question and not for this forum, how effective that registry is. There are agencies in America that have their own registry, that have documented who is received an egg donor and been a gestational carrier. I think that it would be very good, l'chumra, it would be very good to be strict and to say that these people should not marry each other if they were born from the same mother, whether we say that genetically or biologically. An egg and sperm donor, that's why I said before, the sperm donor with a non-Jew, which Rav Moshe spoke about very, very clearly and was repeated that several times in different tshuvot, that was part of a major part of his concern, was that siblings would marry and we wouldn't know, and how do we define lineage, and who is a shtuki and who has a authentic lineage. These are things that we need to think about. And the moment we need to be strict, because we see there are differences of opinion, and there have been different opinions. The best would be to ensure that doesn't happen. One way is to tell the child. Another way is to be responsible parent and to ensure that it doesn't happen. There's other ways of doing that. The reality is, as time goes on and genetics becomes more available to us, everybody, we will come to the point in which people will know that, and it probably would be. And at one point, people didn't tell their children they were adopted, and we know that had very serious ramifications later on in their lives. We should find a way, if that's appropriate, to tell. There's in fact some nice kids books that speak about egg donation, speak about surrogacy in Hebrew. I don't know if there's a similar thing in English for the Jewish community, that actually very nicely is presented as a sort of as a reality, as a chesed someone did for me. That there's a nice book about how one chicken was able to sit on another chicken's eggs until they had to hatch them, and this is nice. This is a nice thing.
What's it called?
Mid go ala beitzim sheli. Who will hatch my eggs? It should be in English, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
We were in South Africa recently, and in Australia recently, and a couple wrote a beautiful book a kid's book about IVF, which I said has to be translated. It's a beautiful little book. And so there are ways of doing it that's appropriate, and that's appropriate for the community. I was with my father the other day, and he said to me, you've been in this business for over 20 years, and he said, have you seen a change? Has it become more I said, definitely. We used to, when I first spoke in a Aguda conference 20-something years ago, we had a little room. It was not on the program. It was very hush-hush. Now we go and we speak at a conference here, Nishmat conference all over the world, to speak about fertility and third party, and no one's embarrassed. And that's L'Tova. That's a Kodesh Baruch Hu gave that ability, gave us that real capacity to help people, to change people's lives with Nishmat's incredible initiative of having this conference and inviting us, and their work and our work and your work as reproductive endocrinologists. We're able to solve these problems within a halachic framework. It's something that nobody should be embarrassed about to say, I use them or I was born from them. And as long as it was done with halachic approval, with supervision, done in the correct manner, this should be absolutely something that we're saving people's lives. Mamash kipshuto.
Yes.
Will you allow me for 1 minute to say something Torah-based? We're about to hear the story of Ruth read on Shavuot. And, it says, Yulad ben Naomi, that Ruth had a child for Naomi. And one of the ways one can hear it is that maybe she was surrogate in many ways, if not, in the same legal way, but in a figurative way. And there was nothing to hide there. It was considered a beautiful story that she did this chesed and that Naomi helped raise the child. And so when we look at that story, maybe there's another perspective. People have families in all kinds of ways. And as Rabbi Weitzman said, if the same things wouldn't have been mentioned in proper circles years ago, today they are discussed openly. And I think that is a big blessing because there's a tremendous amount of chesed that one can do for each other. And, especially in these days, we all said our prayers just before going on this live, on this broadcast, because of the terrible tragedy that happened. But, the chesed that one can do in this field is so tremendous. The chesed that you're doing as a doctor in this field, there's many incredible fields, but helping bringing babies into the world and the chesed that one can do for another as a donor or as a gestational mother, those are incredible things. And they're spoken about openly in the Tanakh and with great deal of blessing. This was the grandfather of the Melech. So I think that we have a great roots for this kind of thing.
Beautiful, really beautiful, and such a great way to end. I think that, you're both so correct that, shame comes from a cultural inawareness, and we're all doing our parts really to raise awareness and cultural sensitivity. This is such a complex and nuanced field, and our patients are so lucky to have Machon Pua, Nishmat, the Israeli ministry, everybody working on their sides to really make this a process that can allow us to continue to have Jewish babies. Thank you both so much for your work. I look forward to working with both of you in the future. Hashem should just continue to guide us.
Amen. Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you and to Nishmat for hosting us.
Thank you, Nishmat. Okay, bye.